Hi guys, thanks for joining. I appreciate it. This is the first time I've ever done a live Q&A, so I'm actually pretty excited about it. Thank you for sending some of your question in advance. Please use the chat, ask your cinematic questions, any production, even post-production questions you may have. Put them in the chat. Hopefully I can see them here on the side and I'll do my best to answer them. But I received quite a few, and so that's fantastic. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to send those in advance, and hopefully you can watch later so that your answers or your questions are answered. But my name is Chris Tenard. I'm the founder of Cinematic, and I'd encourage you to check out the channel just to see all the tips, all the tutorials, all the breakdowns that I have. It's just a great, I think it's a great resource, great place to learn more about cinematography. And really the goal of Cinematic is to speed up the learning curve, so that you can avoid years of mistakes that I've made and hopefully use some of that information and apply it to what you're doing, and help you get to the level that you want to get to faster than if you had to make all those mistakes on your own. So that's the idea. But let's just jump right in. I appreciate it. If you're coming in, please let me know also where you're from in the chat. It's always fun to kind of see where people are joining us from. So use the chat. That'd be great. So I received, I don't know, 30, 40 questions, something like that. And so I'll try to hit most of them, or but in no particular order. I have them in different groups. Like there's exposure question, lighting question, camera setting questions, there are career questions. I'll try to hit some in every category just so it can kind of have a broad um, reference. So the first one I got here is, how do you decide what to expose for when a scene has both bright window and dark interior? And I think that's something that I hear a lot. A lot of people have questions about that. I actually had some interaction on Instagram with a creator there that was struggling with that. And that's the hardest setting. Like that's the hardest environment to actually produce correct exposure, is if you have something extremely bright and then extremely dark. And so it with exposure, there's all kind of ways you can go about it, and it all depends on, one, what you're trying to accomplish, and the gear available, and the amount of control that you have over the environment. And so, in my case, because I deal mostly with corporate films, I don't have access to a full grip truck. I typically don't have 100% control over a situation or over an environment. And so I'm going to assume in this case that we're talking about a window, and that we don't have the ability to go on the outside and put a silk, for example, or a diffuser or anything like that. And so, it has to be a reflection or a thought process about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Is it important for you to expose the window so that you can actually see what's outside the window? Or is it better to let the window blow out and be completely white, and then you can focus on the exposure on the inside? If you're trying to do both, then you need to expose. And I always say you need to expose for the uncontrollable. So in my situation, because in every situation that I'm in, there's always something that I do not control, whether it's the overhead light, like in an office, for example, that I cannot turn off, or a window in this example, then I'm going to expose for that uncontrollable. So I'm going to expose for the window. And then what's going to happen is then the inside is very, very dark. And now I just got to lift all the levels with artificial lighting. And if I don't have enough, then I have to compromise because there's no other solution. So it's a matter of adjusting, in my case, my ND filter to expose the window, raise the levels in the room, and then adjust both to kind of find that compromise where what's important, what's the priority of what I'm trying to expose, so that everything is exposed correctly. Somebody from the UK, Yorkshire. Great. Never been to Yorkshire. Thanks for joining. So that, hopefully that answers that question, you guys. But it's a very difficult and very common situation. I had one recently reach out to me about, he was filming inside of a car, and he was struggling exposing the people inside the car because of the windows outside. the light coming through the windows. And so in that case, it's the same scenario. The only thing you can do with a car is apply ND filter um, gel to the windows so that you cut the amount of light coming into the window. And hopefully that was helpful to him. So here's another one. This one is on lighting. If you could only bring one light to an interview, what would it be and why? Um, so to me, the if I can only bring one, I'm going to bring my most powerful one because I can always dim it down, but I can't, make them brighter than what they can actually output. So in my case, my brightest one is the Amaran 360C. And so if I can only bring one, that's what I will bring, because hopefully it gives me enough um, output to do what I need to do. And you can do a lot with one light. A lot of times I only use one light, and then I can use bounce boards and reflectors or anything else like that to kind of fill or do some kind of something with the backlight. I've used reflectors for that as well. So you can do a lot with just one light. What else? Camera settings. Let's go into camera setting. What is the first camera setting you check on location? That's a great question as well. So camera settings to me are never an exposure tool. I don't use my camera settings for exposure outside of if we count ND filters, because I feel like ND filters is the only one that's truly an exposure setting. It doesn't affect the quality or the creative of the image if I add ND filter. It just cuts light. It doesn't have any effect on motion. It doesn't affect my depth of field. And so I treat camera settings purely as creative tools. So, and then within that, so if we look at ISO, aperture, and shutter speed or shutter angle, because I saw some comments today about me not using shutter angle over but instead using shutter speed. Um, you know, ISO to me is no longer um, a tool that I really use because I shoot native ISO just about 100% of the time. There is some play on that if I need to shoot high base or low base. There's a little bit of play if we start talking about EI, which I use in some occasions. But for the most part, my ISO never changes. So I shoot at native. So then we're left with shutter speed and aperture. And so for me, I always look at aperture as kind of like the first one that I mess with, but I also know kind of what I typically shoot at. My cine lens is a 1.3, and like let's say I'm setting up for an interview. I've shot some interviews at 1.3, but typically I would shoot it as a 2. And so that's probably the one that I check, make sure it's correct, or what I want. And that's probably the one that I adjust the most throughout the shoot, depending on how much depth of field I want. And then my shutter angle or shutter speed, I adjust mostly in my world in corporate film, mostly to remove computer monitor scanning or light flickering. And so, it's not necessarily a creative side of things. It's more removing certain limitation of the location. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, other camera setting. So this one asks, when do you change ISO, aperture, or ND? And so ND is like, to me, is the golden ticket because it allows me to change my exposure levels without compromising my creative intent. And so if I set up my camera to shoot very shallow depth of field at a very specific shutter angle or shutter speed, then I can leave it that way and move from location to location and just add or remove ND filters based on where I'm at, and it will maintain that creative intent. So I have the same depth of field everywhere I go, and I don't have to worry about, I went from this room to that room, and now the computer is now visible because I changed my shutter speed. So ND filter is probably the one that I play the most with outside of aperture if I need to change my depth of field. But that's a really normal part of my workflow is when I first come in, I would put, I don't know, an ND10 or something like that into the camera and then start building my lighting around that. And then that gives me the flexibility to add or remove. Lenses, let's look at lenses. Uh, okay, how do you make an interview background feel intentional? And I've been in so many different situations of just the worst possible location to some really amazing looking space to do interviews. And at the end of the day, how do you make the background feel intentional? Well, you have to be intentional. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Like you have to actually think through what is it that I'm trying to do with this background. Am I wanting to add a little splash of light over here to this detail of the room so that I can bring this little plant up into the view of viewers or whatever the situation is. But you have to really go through a process of thinking through those shots and not just randomly. I'm just going to put my camera up and this is this is what I have to shoot. So yeah, I think the first step to be intentional is being intentional. Really spend some time thinking through. And I know we all have like time constraint as far as how much time we have to film all those interviews. But take as much time as you have to really start thinking through what does this background look like and what can I do with it? Where can I add some light? Where can I remove light? To me, removing light is key to making a real impact, to really change things. Is how can I remove some of that light to create some separation? So just think through what you actually are trying to do. Let's see. Okay, this question is great. What do you do when you walk into a terrible location? And I think we've all experienced that. I just actually released a video this week, a couple days ago, on just that, where I walked into just my worst scenario of just an empty room. And so I think in those instances, yes, I spent a lot more time thinking and looking at it and trying to figure out what is the room actually giving me? What are some of the things that I can use? What are some of the strength of that room, if there's any, that I can kind of amplify, kind of play with to try to do something? And again, in that instance, removing light was key. So I would encourage you to watch that because it was a room, blank room with just a bunch of windows. And the first thing was to just drop the intensity, drop the level in the room, just add a bunch of ND, because the moment you make things a lot darker in your camera, now you have control. Now you can place one light here, one light there, and you really have control over what it looks like. And so if it's really bad, like if there's really nothing, man, I think I would go super shallow depth of field, try to blur the background as much as possible. Again, kill the levels as much as possible, and just not rely on showing the background as much, as or show it as little as possible, to just try to focus on the person I'm interviewing, and maybe like a super close up at that point, and just fill this frame with your subject. But those are tough. Um, okay, this one is good. This is color. Color grading is probably my weakest thing. I mean, I do color grading every day, but I'm not a colorist, and it's so technical today that I do okay, but that's not my strongest point. But this question is great. How should exposure decisions support the grade? And that's really good question. In some cases, um, for me, and it's rare, and I think it would be more applicable to people that are in narrative or big budget work. But if you have the grade in advance, if you've worked a grade ahead of time, even if it's just a reference that tells you this is kind of where the picture is going to land as far as the levels of shadows, highlights, midtones, then you can shoot to the grade, meaning you can expose based on that grade. So you could actually upload that LUT into your monitor and tweak your lighting and your exposure to match what that the requirement of that particular grade. And if you have a good DIT, that's what they would do, right? Like you shoot something and then you give it to the DIT, they'll put it through the grade and can tell you, hey, we're a little low, we're a little high, and you can adjust that way. In my world, it's pretty rare that I have the luxury of doing that. And so um, most of the time it's about capturing high quality data so that you have as much flexibility in post production to manipulate the image the way you want. And so, it's making sure you preserve the highlights as much as possible, create as much separation as possible between shadows, midtones, and highlights. That's a huge thing. If I'm able to create separation between those different areas of my picture, then in post production I can lower and raise those kind of the way I want. And so if I don't have an applicable grade on set, then the goal for me is to capture the best possible data so I have flexibility. Yeah, so on the business side, those were tough too. How do you get your first paying client? um, it's That's tough. I you know I've done everything. Like I started in '04, and I've done just about any kind of job you can think of. And at first, I think my first paid job was actually came from friends of mine. Probably the first two or three jobs came from friends of mine. Um, I think the very first one was actually a funeral. I went and filmed a funeral. Um, and then, yeah, and then I had, I think, the same friend or somebody connected to that friend. I knew somebody who needed some work done for their work, and they had very little budget, so they thought, well, we can get this guy. He's pretty cheap. He's just starting. So, but I've done everything to get started. I actually joined some production association, met some guys that were pretty senior, and kind of volunteered. I would say, hey, I'll come on set, do whatever you need me to do, and you don't need to pay me. And then, if they're good people, they'll still pay you a little bit. But I did that for quite a while to just kind of get my feet wet. And then finding a niche too. Like I think some of the mistake in the beginning is to try to do all kind of production. And I didn't want to do event. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I've done quite a few, actually, helping somebody. Like I assisted somebody who was very successful in the wedding business. So I've done it quite a while, and I saw that industry, and it just not something that was feeding me, that I felt was something I wanted to continue to do. Um, and so it was good for me to like narrow kind of the scope of what I wanted to do. I tried real estate videos for a while, and quickly was like, nope, that's not for me either. And so then you can start focusing on target clients. Like, okay, I'd love to do corporate work, and who do I know in my circles that can help me? And I think that's how I got my first, I don't know if you'd call it real client, but I guess my first corporate client was, again, through a friend that worked in a marketing department of a hospital, and they were doing a lot of video work, and they had a video guy. And eventually, just through the relationship, he kind of gave me a shot, and then eventually I ended up doing years of work for them as well. Um, so so that's one way. The other thing I would say on that is, one of my favorite story is how I landed my largest client, or one of my largest client. And I'm not going to go into the details here. We can talk about that a different time. If you want to know, just reach out to me. But it was about, so it was a public, it was actually a town, a municipality, and they put an RFP. And I've never done an RFP. And, my thought was, man, how many people are going to compete for this thing? And I knew at that point that I needed to do something different. And so I really focused on how do I position myself differently than anybody else. I may be completely off price wise. I might be completely off as far as my ability to deliver compared to some of the other ones, but I want them to remember the guy. I want them to remember me, right? And so I had an in-person meeting prior to submitting my proposal. And I live in Arizona, which is a pretty relaxed, casual state as far as business is concerned. And I showed up in a three-piece suit. And I did that simply because I wanted them to remember the guy that showed up in a three-piece suit. So I did that. And then obviously on the proposal side, I also did something very unique so that I knew that my proposal was going to be very different than everybody else. And eventually I landed the gig that way. So hopefully that helps. Let's go back up to some lighting questions. This one, how do you make a simple interview setup look cinematic? So everybody, that's like the buzzword, right? Like everybody wants to make their work look cinematic. Um, so for me, that comes back to lighting and it comes back to contrast. And you know the difference between my key side, my fill side, the background, um, those relationships between highlights, mid-tone, and shadows have to be defined. Hopefully, in my case, I love when they're very far apart, when there's a big difference between those components. And so, in an interview setup, again, I think the key to me is removing light. If you can create shadows on the wall, on the person. Now, there's ways to create shadows and ways that doesn't look right. Like we don't want like a giant nose shadow, super harsh. But if we can create difference here, where this is a lot darker than this side, then it will help. And so, bringing on set negative material has been the easiest way to really improve my production value because I can just bring cloth. I have pop-ups that have negative sides of them, and I can just hold them on a simple stand, put it really close to the person, and it creates something dramatically different than if I didn't have that. So that's a great, easy way to do that. Um, Next session, 271, is just joined us. Thanks for being here. You're at work. Wow, I'm glad you're paying attention at work. All right, lighting. How do you handle mixed color temperature? And that's super common, especially in my field. Again, I shoot in corporate office most of the time. There are windows everywhere. There's fluorescent lighting everywhere. So that's something that I deal with on a pretty regular basis. In the corporate setting, if I don't have a specific look that I'm going for and I just want to go kind of neutral, then it's a matter of making sure I do a white balance. I use a white balance card that's flooded evenly between, not evenly, but accordingly to where my camera is pointing, between how much daylight is coming in and how much overhead light is coming in, and doing my white balance that way. And typically I can get pretty close. If we're doing something that's really difficult, where it's a huge window bringing all that daylight in, and then for some reason all their lights are 3200 Kelvin, my first intuition is going to be, is there a way for me to shut those off? And if it's not, if I don't have a way of turning those lights off, is there a way for me to block those lights? So I've been in plenty of situations where the ceiling has overhead lighting that I cannot control. If it's a tube, I can reach up, I can, put a chair, reach up, turn the tube off. And I've done that many times. But if it's LED lights or whatever it is up there that I don't have control over, what I can do is I can put a negative pop-up over my subject, right off a frame. I would put a black cover so that it would eliminate some of the lights from some of that 32K light coming into my subject. And that's super helpful. And I do that fairly often, whether it's for color temperature issue or just, man, like the best spot for that person to sit is right under this spotlight and it looks awful. I'm just going to cover it. So that's an easy way to do it. Camera settings. How do you no, let's not do that one. Oh, well, we can do that one. How do you choose white balance instead of using auto white balance? That's an easy one. I never shoot auto anything. Auto, especially auto white balance. I I think the only time I would think of that is if we're going from outside to inside. Like if it's a walking shot, I'm on a gimbal or something, and I'm walking from inside to outside, and there's just this enormous change. The reality is, I try not to do those shots because it's very difficult to make those look right. Lighting wise, it's got. I mean, you need you need like automatic ND filters or whatever and so I just tend to stay away from those shots because for me, there's a point in my career where I kind of switch from uh, quantity to quality, meaning, I'm shooting those corporate videos and I'm like, man, I need so much B-roll because we're doing a 4-minute piece or whatever it is. And then realizing, yeah, those shots look awful. And so I'm just going to focus on really good shots. Now I need some, I need plenty of them. So it's hard, but if I'm feeling like that shot is just not going to be a successful shot, it's not going to look good. I'm not going to waste my time on it. In that situation, going from outside to inside, I would rather do two shots, right? I'm going to set up inside, have him walk through the door, and then cut from the outside, and then do it that way. And I know it's different than what we're talking about, but I would rather do that well than a move that's just not going to look good. A lot of time when we talk about camera movement, I often say um, simple move well executed is much better than complex move poorly executed every time. So I would rather do a slow push that's just nice and steady and just really well lit than this complex camera movement that reveals all kind of issues as far as my lighting is concerned. Okay. Well, here's one on camera movement. When should the camera move? So I have a couple of videos on camera movement that I would encourage you to go look at. There's when we talk about camera movement, there is motivated movement and unmotivated movement. Motivated is simply when the camera has to move to follow something. Like if the camera doesn't move, you missed the shot, right? Whether it's a car moving down the street and you're following it, or somebody walking down a hallway that you're moving with them. That's called motivated movement. And at the end of the day, that one has to move. So we don't need to really spend a lot of time talking about motivated movement. When you're asking yourself, when should it move? We're talking about unmotivated movement. Like there's no real physical reason why the camera should move. And now it's a creative decision. And what I tell people all the time about camera movement is you're taking your viewers, you're asking your viewers to follow you. You're saying, hey, come with me, follow me. I want to show you something. And so at the end of the day, that movement needs to achieve something at the end to reward those viewers for following you. If you just move the camera and it doesn't end on a reveal of something or a different perspective of what we're looking at, then I'm not sure that movement is worth anything, because you're going to leave your viewers kind of feeling like that's it, that was it. And I've seen plenty of like really great films where yet that still happens, where as a viewer I feel kind of like disappointed, like why did you take me on this journey if there was nothing, no extra information that you provided for me here. And sure, the move itself can be that, right? So like if I'm slowly pushing towards somebody to build tension, that movement builds the tension. And so that's still a goal. You're still achieving that, building that tension with the camera movement. So as long as you have a goal and objective and you're achieving it with that movement, then I think it's the right place to move. For me, and that's a very personal thing. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying for me, I'm not going to move the camera if I don't have the tools to move the camera in a steady way. So I don't do any handheld. And I know a lot of people that I work with are kind of like, what? Why not? It's just not my thing. It's not my clientele. And I would do handheld if it fits, like, if I need to follow somebody, like jumping onto a subway or going through a crowd. And even that, I would probably still have some kind of a motion control, like whether it's a easy rig or some kind of gimbal with me, versus just literally on shoulder or just handhelding the camera. So if I don't have the tools to execute the movement that I have in my head, then I'm not doing it. Um, okay. What piece of gear makes the biggest difference? I mentioned that earlier. I think for me, so I guess it depends on where you're at in your career and what equipment you already have. Two things on the cheap side, negative fill is like by far some of the best tools to get because it again it's sort of versatile. I can use an egg to block a window. I can use an egg to block unwanted light. I can use an egg to create contrast. So and it's again it doesn't weigh a lot. It's cheap. So that's a great tool to have. By far, the biggest improvement in my equipment has been my lenses. And I remember when it was time for me to like kind of turn my gear over, maybe 4 years ago, maybe a little bit more, um, was the first time I put real money into a lens and bought a cine lens. I bought the Canon, which is the one you see behind me here, the 50 millimeter Cine E, 1.3. And, I didn't even have a good camera at the time. I just put it on my Sony A7 III. But even just that, to be able to put that kind of lens on my little A7 completely changed the look of my image. Obviously depth of field being a 1.3, that was just unbelievable. So it kind of depends on where you're at and what you're doing, but lens much more impactful than camera bodies, for example. Camera body is important, but man, if I only have money for one or the other, I'm going to spend money on the lens, which is at the sadness of my wife because she knows that's where the money goes. Let's see. Um, this one I kind of answered. How do you build a portfolio that attracts the right work? Man, that's tough. So I've never spent a ton of time onto a reel. I think the reel that's on my current website is like from 2017, and I haven't updated it since. And it's probably awful. Probably awful. Um, so I think um, what I focused on, and maybe to best answer that question, is my portfolio is my reputation. Yes, I need to have the examples to show. Even though it's pretty rare that I actually have to show my work. People come to me through word of mouth from other clients. Knowing my other clients, that definitely helps, right? So if I meet with this company and they know that I've done work for that company, that's very helpful. Um, so how do you go about getting to that? I think for me, I saw a huge flip in how I can talk to clients. Like I remember, like I literally remember the event. I actually it was on the phone with a huge company that's still a client today. So like 13, 14 years later. And it was a big, big contract. And I've never saw myself as a salesperson. And they asked me, they're like, hey, we got a quote from somebody else who's like half the amount. So why should we pick you? And they're a very prestigious brand. And I said, well, you charge what you charge because this is who you are. This is the quality that you produce. And I charge what I charge because I believe that I produce better quality than most people. And that's it. That's all I said. And it was like silence on the phone. And I thought I had like put myself in a hole. And I just waited. I just knew I'm just going to let him sit. That's my position. I don't need to justify to you why I charge what I charge. And the client came right back and say, that's exactly what we wanted to hear. And I've been doing work for them for like 13 or 15 years, something like that. But there was that shift in my clients hearing my expertise. And that came through learning the language, learning how to express why we need this, why am I doing it that way? Why do I want all this equipment, what does that do? Using certain word to really, I don't want to say justify, um, but I think that still is the case, like justifying my work to them, and then it just turned into they trust my expertise because I'm using language that is surprising, maybe, right? When we talk about um, how the brain interacts with what a viewer sees on screen, if you're able to use some of that language to explain to your clients why we're going to do this level of production, and how it's going to be perceived by the audience, then my experience has been my clients fully trust that. They don't question it. They're like, yep, that's what we want. We want our clients, we want our viewers to really look at this product right here. And I'm going to accomplish that by doing this, this, and this. And they trust. So it wasn't about building a portfolio. It was by building my expertise, be able to really speak in certain words, and then be able to then translate that into a deliverable and to actually produce the quality. And so it's all about learning. It's all about spending hours of reading materials, watching things, listening to podcasts, things like this, where you can hear from other people and learn from their mistakes and continue to build your skill set. Hopefully that helps. Obviously, um, volunteering, um, free, you know, volunteering your services to organizations to then have the footage to build your portfolio is a great way to do it. If you want, like I know a lot of guys in the field where once a year they do a free video for a nonprofit, and that's just a way for them to continue to build their portfolio and do something a little bit more creative that they can use in their reel. What else? What is the biggest lighting mistakes beginners make? Uh, the biggest mistake beginners makes in lighting, I think what I see the most is um, not enough separation. So it could be too much lighting, right? Like they just flood everything. That was my mistake when I started. I would just put light everywhere. Now, again, it was a different time where lighting was pretty extreme. But by having too much light, then everything is kind of like the same level everywhere, or not enough light, right? If you don't use lights at all and you're just shooting it the way it is, then all the levels stay kind of the same. So I think that's probably the biggest mistake, is not enough separation in your lighting, whether it comes from having too much or not enough. Uh, and and I think a lot of times, like we don't see enough contrast. Like everything that we watch, not everything that we watch, a lot of things that we watch, especially if you watch like daytime stuff, or I don't know, whatever you, I don't know. Like all those shows today, like all those reality TVs, for example, Bachelorette, all those things, like everything is just flooded with lights and there's no contrast. There's no difference in lighting. It's like wherever they walk, it's perfect lighting everywhere. And it just, to me, looks awful. Like there's just no texture and no anything. And so learning how to embrace the shadows, I think is a great skill set. What else? How do you use practical lights without letting them dominate? Yep. Uh, Practical lights are great, but they demand control. And so, um, you know, it's either you need the equipment, so like simple, like a aperture light bulb in your kit, and you can replace that light bulb in the corner, for example, and now you have control over it and you can dial the intensity or whatever you need to do. Um, yeah, if it's something that I don't have control of, like it could be like, I'm going to take it to an extreme that I've never had, but let's say there's like a giant TV wall or like an LED wall on the side, and it's just bombarding my, my subject. Then I have to find a way to block that. If that's the only place I can shoot, and I have no control over this thing, then I'm going to block it as much as I can. Unless I can, unless I have enough light where I can ND filter, drop the levels of that practical, and then light up my subject accordingly, which would be my preferred method. But that's again assuming that you have enough light to do that. But if we're talking about like a lamp that you have no control over in the corner that you want to show, but that's very, very intense, then that's how I would do it, is I would just use my ND filter, just lower everything. And now you just need to light your subject with artificial lighting. Camera settings. We talked about that one. Okay, how do frame rate and shutter angle affect the feeling of motion? So that's, I mean, so I have a couple of videos on shutter speed and shutter angles that I would encourage you to look, because we can spend a lot of time there. I think where I differ, or where I had the most conversation with uh, people in the business, whether starting or experienced, is I don't believe, or I shouldn't say believe, I don't follow the shutter angle rule. I think, to me, that shutter angle rule is outdated. And I've met guys that were like, "Oh no, I never touch my shutter. Like, it's twice the frame rate, and that's it. I don't touch it." I'm like, "Well, then why is it here? Like, why do we even have that option? And let me show you an example of this picture. How would you do this picture without touching your shutter speed?" And you can't, because again, the shutter is there to do one thing, and that's to control motion blur. And so if you want a picture that has a lot of motion blur, you're going to have to adjust your shutter speed. So this shutter rule, to me, is kind of silly, and I understand why it's there, but I encourage people to break it all the time, for a couple reasons. One, you want to have full control of your image, and if your idea of this particular image is street cars going down the street in full blur motion, then you need to lower your shutter speed. If you're doing something the opposite, where you want very sharp subject that's moving very fast, then you need to raise your shutter. The relationship between frame rate and shutter angle really, to me, goes only to understanding that you cannot lower your shutter speed lower than your frame rate. I mean, you can, but then you get some crazy artifacts, right? Or you do it in time lapse, for example, where you're only taking one picture every X amount of seconds, and that's your opening. So yeah, so that's probably the only thing I would say on the shutter angle relationship, is I would encourage people to really experiment with shutter, because don't look at it as this thing where it's like, oh no, like all what I learned in school, all the things that I read is all like, it needs to be double the frame rate. Um, I'm not gonna cuss on there, but to me, I just I throw that out the window, and I know I'm gonna get some flack for that, but that's okay. Um, what else? Okay. How do you build trust with someone uncomfortable on camera? So I wrote a tiny little, I don't want to call it a book. It's like a booklet. It's like a few pages. It's available on Amazon. It's like $3 or something. Um, it's called The Art of Interviewing, and I really believe that interviewing is an art, and the main skill set in interviewing is listening. And so there's a lot of things that I do or don't do when I'm interviewing. Like, the main one is I don't write my questions down. I don't have a notepad in front of me, because I want to be looking at that person the entire time, so that they feel listened to. It was kind of funny, maybe like, and I've been doing this for like, 10, 15 years, interviews or whatever. But I just did one like 2 weeks ago. And when we were done, the guy was like, "Man, like, the way you do that, the way you stay locked in with me really makes me feel comfortable, because I feel like I'm heard, versus like we're actually having a conversation, versus, you're looking down at your note thinking about the next question." So that's one way, is to really stay engaged with them. When I have somebody that's really nervous and like just it's very difficult. What I tend to do, and it's hard because what I'm like the tips that I'm going to give you are because of who I am. So it needs to be you. It can't be something you force, right? So like what I'm doing may not be what works for you just because that's may not be your personality. But for me, what I do when somebody is very uncomfortable and they're just struggling, then I'm going to make fun of myself. I'm going to show them that I'm in the same boat of I am not above making mistakes here. So one of the line that I use when they first sit down and before we start the interview is I always say like, I'm going to ask you a bunch of random questions, whatever. And then I say, and if I ask you a dumb question, just let me know it's a dumb question and we can move on. And that simple statement lets them know that I'm also in a vulnerable place of like, I don't know, this might not be a smart question at all. Um, and so I would find ways for them to see the human side of who I am by either telling them a joke or a story about when I really messed up or whatever, or when I was very nervous and doing an interview or whatever, just to make them feel like they're not alone in that. Um, and and um, and sometimes to have like really random conversation in between questions is also really good. Like if you notice something, you're like, oh, I wonder about this over here or whatever. I've done it with my camera operator. That's one way too of like they need to feel protected. So if especially if it's a woman, if she sits down and we're going to take extra time and I'm going to say, "Hey, can you go check, the left side, like her hair is sticking out a little bit, or can you adjust this or that on that side of her face?" That lets them know, like, oh, they're actually looking out for me. They're making sure things are okay because they're already worrying about what they're going to look like. And so by amplifying that, and maybe there's nothing wrong with her hair, but you're sending the person behind there to say, can you touch that up a little bit? Can you make sure, her shirt is straight or necklace is in the middle, whatever it is, that lets them know you're there to take care of them. And that sometimes helps. I'm going to stay on interview for one more. How much planning do you do before an interview? So I told you I don't have a notepad. I don't write questions down. I don't have something that I read. How much planning? I almost none, um, because it goes back to what we just talked about. I think I'm curious by nature. And so if we can just have a conversation about whatever the topic is, um, I think we're going to be just fine. And my goal in my work, and that's my work, and it may not be your work, but my work is all about genuine stories, about having people be as human as possible. And so I want to remove any kind of corporate feel. And so if we can have just a normal conversation. Um, and I told him, I tell him when they sit in the chair, I'm like, man, your biggest job today is to ignore all this madness, ignore all the lights, ignore the cameras, and let's just try to have this conversation. And so, and typically, I get all the content that I need that way. I don't need to research a lot of stuff now, unless I go to like a very, very technical thing, where maybe I do a video for a company that built this widget, and it's about the process of building this widget. But even then, I would feel pretty comfortable just say, "Hey, can you just walk me through how this works, or how did you guys come up with this design, or whatever it is?" And then we can go from there. And based on their answer, I'm going to dig into some areas, even if I don't speak the language. I feel like I can get my way out of that and get the answers that we need just because of a curious nature. So not a lot of prep work. Um, so there's been a few questions about pricing, and that's always tricky, especially because depending on where you're at, it could be very different. How do you price corporate video work? And then there's another question that says, should equipment be included in the day rate? And um, I've I've seen both methods. I'm the guy who doesn't break down my proposal as far as the equipment because I am not interested in my client telling me the kind of gear I need or don't need to achieve the goals of the video. So if I feel like, man, I really want this gimbal with me, I don't want this to be a line item where they can say, hey, can we just scrape this off and that one off so that we can cut some money off the budget? No. So my pricing is a day rate. It's X amount for the day, and that's it. And um, typically it would give a little bit of information, like very basic, like this is a 2 camera audio lighting package. Um, you know, Now if I have some really unique stuff, like if they want to rent, like if they're like, we need to shoot on an RE Alexa. I don't have an RE Alexa. I'm like, yep, no problem. We can rent one. And that I will probably put as a line item. So they'll see my day rate, and then they would see the rental for the Alexa. So there's things like that. That I've had jobs where I needed to rent a full grip truck. So same thing, I would put the grip truck rental in there. But as far as gears that I own, I don't. It's all included in my day rate. So when I show up with all my gear, and that way they don't have an opportunity to tell me, nope, I don't want to pay for this or that. Hopefully that helps. Um, what mistakes did you make early in your career that you would avoid today? What mistakes that I made? I made a lot of I made a lot of mistakes. I'm currently working on my exposure course. It should be available in August, by the way. Uh, and in that course, actually just yesterday, I was filming a module, and I talked about, early on in my career. So I'm a creative person, and I use that as an excuse to not learn the technical side of things. So I would have, you know, a DP or a camera operator and maybe a grip guy, so that they would handle all that side of things, and I could just focus on, this is the type of shots that I want. Go ahead and execute that. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's how the industry works at the highest level, right? Like you have a director, you have a DP, you have a gaffer, you have a grip, all of those things. You have an audio person, for example, um, and that's totally okay. But I feel like I got to a place where, because I was relying on other people, I didn't know the limitations. So if they told me like, no, we can't do that, or we can't do that without this gear, or we would have to do it this way, I would have no way of knowing whether that was correct or offering any other solution. And so I think not learning the technical side of things, simply because I was probably afraid of, like, man, I don't know this stuff, and it sounds and looks very complicated. Um, so I just use creativity as an excuse not to learn. um, I would encourage people to really spend time in learning the technical side of things, because it will definitely give you creative freedom. The more you understand the technical side of things, the more you can do things with your images, and the more you can do things with your crew. Because today, if I hire a DP, which I do from time to time, um, he can't BS me. Like, and we can have great conversation about, this is what I want, and right away that person will understand that I know what I'm talking about, and so it typically gets the most out of people anyway. And that goes back to this question too, that say, how do you keep improving after many years of cinema as a cinematographer? And for me, it's that's an interesting question at this point in my career, because I'm 52, and a lot of my peers are starting to look at retirement and kind of being done with the industry, and I'm the opposite, where I feel like the technology of what is coming down the pipe and what's already out there is unbelievable to me, and it just fuels me. And so I'm constantly learning, constantly watching podcasts and reading articles and trying new techniques, and developing new ways of doing what I do, because not because I don't want to not work, but because I love it. I think it's unbelievable what the equipment can do today, and so to be able to use those to the max of their ability is awesome. Any questions you guys have? I keep looking. There's still a bunch that we haven't hit, but um, that's interesting. In lenses, like this guy asked, what matters more, focal length or camera distance? And I don't know if one matters more than the other. I'm a guy who shoots 90% of my work with the 50 mil back there. So most of my work is changing the camera's distance. But I've also worked for a director. I was the DP on a documentary, and that director was actually a still photographer, a very, very talented photographer. And she absolutely loved the look of long focal length, zoomed in, right, and compressed the background. And to the point where we shot ton of stuff that I could have shot with the 50 very easily. We shot with my 100 400. Sometime, well, probably not too many at fully 400, but 300 millimeter. And so moving way back and then zooming all the way in to create that compression of the background. And that's what she liked. And at first I was like, well, that's kind of silly. And then you look at the difference and you're like, well, this is, I mean, that's a look. And so if that's the look you want, that's great. This is how to do it. And so to me, there's no one better than the other. Um, but there's definitely something to say about long focal length, compressing that background. It will give you a definite different look than if you use a 50 and move closer. I've also done the other way. I just did a video on that not too long ago, where I started using a 35 millimeter and bring the camera closer than with my 50, and now giving kind of like context, like you see more on the frame, but you're still intimate with the subject. So I can get close to somebody, but with the 35 instead of the 50, I'm now showing more of the environment around that person, and that helps as far as giving context. All right, we'll probably do a couple more, and then we'll call it a day. But uh, when should you choose hard light over soft light? So, I mean, to me, that's an intent question. There's no reason for me to choose harsh light unless I want to show harsh light, harsh shadows. I do like um, three-quarter back, kind of harsh three-quarter backlight, right? So instead of like right now, I've got a backlight on top of my head, and there's a light kind of like back on that wall above me. Um, but if we move that light, oops, to that corner, or actually even this corner, and then kind of like it would hit this side, then I would want that to be a lot harsher. That's a look, that's a feel of, if I put three-quarter and just blast it. I've done that quite a few times, even in corporate film, and it looks really good. It looks edgy, looks new, um, kind of, yeah, modern maybe. I don't. Is that still a word? I don't know what that means, but yeah, it's a good feel. Actually, I just did one maybe four weeks ago outside of New York, and that's kind of what we did. So they were sitting in a conference room that has all kind of windows on one side, and then on the other side, instead of putting a small little top light that barely would have done anything just because of all those windows, I put a light three-quarter and just blast them right here, and it just gives you something very different, and so that works pretty good. Um, what is So this is back to exposure. What is the difference between changing EI and changing the recorded exposure? This is a great question. We'll probably finish with that one. Um, that one, I get a lot of crazy comments on my video on EI because I think there's still a lot of things maybe that I don't understand, or a lot of things that people don't understand about EI. The two things that I would say is, because of an update that DaVinci Resolve made a couple of years back, uh, I got surprised because I was doing some tests with EI, and my understanding was EI is not something that's recorded in camera. So whatever I do with EI doesn't change what the image is going to look like in the recorded image. And I recorded some image. I was rolling camera, and I switched my EI while I was recording. I put the footage into DaVinci, and all of a sudden I see the image shift. Every time I change the EI, the exposure of the image would shift in DaVinci. And I freak out because I was like, how is this possible? I thought EI never changed the recorded image. And I actually called a bunch of friends of mine that worked in Cine EI, and they confirmed, they're like, no, it doesn't change it. Turned to find out, with Sony, DaVinci now has Sony RAW, and it uses, instead of taking the ISO value, it now uses the EI value as the default exposure value for your post-production. So if you shot it at 400 EI, it would show you the 400 EI image, not the 800 EI. The beauty of that is now you can adjust the EI in post-production. So it's basically just using the metadata, and you can adjust it. So you can change it from 400 to 200 or back to 800, whatever you want to do. And I think that's the real future of sensors, where ISO is just going to be a metadata, which happens on other cameras, where it's not something you change. You just add that in post-production. Like on the Red, for example, was like that. And so so that's the first thing to really understand, is like, okay, it may not record it, but it's still the default value that in post-production will be used on some of the software, which I think is a great thing. Like, I think to have ISO as a metadata that I can manipulate in post-production is great. The second thing that I would say is I tested EI extensively for the video that I did a couple years back. And what I did, like a simple test, was I put the lens cap on my lens, and I record a black signal. And then I put that signal through a waveform, and you could see the waveform on the signal. And when I recorded that at different EI value. And so basically what I'm saying is, now the signal that I'm seeing on the waveform is the noise floor, because there is no light coming into the lens. So what the signal that I'm seeing on the waveform is the noise level, the noise floor of that particular signal, of that particular camera or that particular sensor. When I adjusted that, I expected the line to go down, the stop, every time I change my EI, which it did. What I did not expect is the thickness of the line also reduced. So every time I went down one stop, not only did the level drop, but the thickness of the signal reduced, meaning there was a lot less noise at 200 EI, so two stop below, than at native 800. So there is something, and so I started doing some research on kind of what's happening. And so there's a process that the sensor goes through as far as capturing the image and putting some amplification and then doing some noise reduction to deliver the final product. And we don't know, like, on Sony, they didn't release any of that data as far as exactly what they're doing to the signal. But it was obvious to me that the signal is treated differently in EI mode than in native ISO, because it reduces that, the thickness of that signal. And so I started doing all kind of tests, shooting all kind of shadows in different EI values, and sure enough, those shadows are a lot sharper, not simply because you have to light an extra stop, but somehow that signal is treated differently than at native ISO. So anyway, hopefully that helps. So I play with the EI quite a bit, just because I know that the signal is treated differently. And I actually talked to a feature film DP here in town that I know, and he shot his entire feature film, his latest feature film, using EI and dropping down, I believe, 2 stops. It may have been 1 stops, because he saw the same thing as far as the quality of the signal is different than at native. Anyway, thank you so much, you guys, for joining. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully this was valuable to you guys. I'd love to do it again. If keep sending those questions. You can send that at questions@cinematic.com. And if you have more coming through, then maybe I'll do another session like this live, maybe in a couple of weeks. So thanks for joining. I really appreciate you guys' time, and we'll talk to you soon.